Lun Ferency, welcome to Seeking the Beyond Theology with Jono. Will you please introduce yourself for us?
So I'm Alon Ferency, rabbi in East Tennessee, United States. I formerly a pulpit rabbi, now work with artists around the world, helping them form spiritual practices to undergird their creative work. What else would you like me to share for now? Just, just the
Tell me a little,
basics.
just the basics. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So
So you work with creative people. What does that look like?
I was going to be sarcastic and say it's a lot of crying. No, it's fun. I spent 12 years in the pulpit, and then years before that in training with mostly congregational work, some hospital work, rehab work. I like artists. They're very open to new experience. They're very open to spiritual questions and seeking and a little bit of prodding. Um, they're very tender. So it's like trying to catch a butterfly. You have to be really gentle with them.
Yeah.
They have fascinating ideas. A lot of them have spiritual and religious baggage. Plus, I get to hear art that they're making, and sometimes it's really special. And sometimes I get to be the first or second person to hear a new song or see a new chapter, and reflect, and sometimes see some of the things we've talked about in that work. Um, if we read a psalm together and I see imagery from the psalms, that's really beautiful. Things like that. Yeah.
You use the language catching a butterfly. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Um, how do you catch a butterfly? What strategies do you use?
Uh, I'm not good at it. That metaphor was told to me when I was dating, and it
Mhm.
was trying to explain why my dates always went poorly because I was trying to grasp butterflies and not let them land on me. It is lower Z, lower Z. Do you say Z or Z?
Yes, I say Z in Australia.
Yeah, lower Z, Zen, not traditional Zen, but the kind of the commonplace idea of Zen, like not forcing an issue. Um, but I think with any spiritual counseling, it's about letting the client or person being counseled or directee, whatever term and relationship it is, do a lot of the steering. Um, it's about patience, generosity, compassion, and effective sharing of one's own story and connecting them to appropriate textual, scriptural, sacred resources, whether it's a ritual or a prayer. I don't know. It's about connecting the part of me that hasn't always been an artist,
Hmm.
that wasn't always in full use. And congregational life can be somewhat conventional. So getting to be with artists who are very rarely conventional has been delightful. And it's really liberated a part of me that I'd forgotten about. It's funny. You would appreciate this.
Yep.
So um, this is a deep cut for Dungeons and Dragons fans. So, so in my youth, I took levels in Wizard, and I was very
Yes.
mathematical and science oriented. And then I took a couple of levels of Bard, multi-classed into Bard when I worked in the arts. And then I took a lot of levels of Cleric when I worked in faith systems. And now I'm taking more levels in Bard. I'm going to top off with some levels in Bard, like 19 and 20. So that's my multi-class. I actually, oh God, I should have shared this with you before. I made a character sheet for 5e based on the work I do and the spells I know, like
Yep.
bless and
Bless.
commune
Yep.
and heal wounds, healing
Heal
word.
wounds.
Yeah. Leomin's
That's
tiny hut, like creating sacred spaces, so
Oh, cool. So I thought
yeah.
we'd talk about, I've been an avid role player for many years. I enjoy Dungeons and Dragons. Um, as a young person, I love to read fiction, The Hobbit, um, Lord of the Rings, all sorts of magical journey stories. Um, how did your journey with Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games begin?
Oh God, that goes into some dark places.
Only what you're comfortable sharing.
No. I mean, in the sense of like, I'm a little older than you, so in my generation, I always quote Stephen Colbert, the American talk show host. that when we played D&D, you needed three friends who could keep a secret. Like it wasn't a public phenomenon the way it is after
Aha,
Critical Role
yes,
and some other
yes,
things.
yes.
It was if it wasn't shameful, it was a little embarrassing.
Mm,
Um, and I, to be honest, I probably bought my first book when I was 8. I have a copy of the Fiend Folio that I signed in second grade.
yep.
And so I doubt I read them cover to cover. I think I looked at a lot of the images and it would like fuel fantasies and nightmares and story ideas. I didn't play much as a kid. I used to collect and play very rarely. And it was only about 10 or 12 years ago when I needed a hobby because Skyrim and Fallout 3 were going to ruin my marriage. My wife says, "You need a hobby." And I thought, well, I could fly drones. That interests me, or I could learn to code, but I spend too much time on the computer anyway with work.
Mhm.
So I was like, what about this thing I always enjoyed as a kid, but never really got to explore enough? So I started reconnecting with people here and finding some games here, probably 10, 11, 12 years ago. And then eventually mastered and ran my own games, which I do every Thursday night.
Every Thursday
So,
night.
but in contrast to you, I really love science fiction. Like
Aha,
my
so do
home, my
I.
home base is science fiction.
I love
Fantasy
sci-fi.
is nice, but I love science fiction. Like I think it asks a lot of great theological questions. When you
Mm.
talk about like AI and transhumanity, where people can, go into different bodies and just questions of the soul and the divine. Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's unpack that. I've got Morpheus on the wall
I
behind me.
saw. And I think the
Um,
Hubble Space Telescope picture
this
is
is
that
James
was,
Webb. This is James
oh,
Webb,
that's
which
Webb.
is
That's Webb.
the newer one.
That's a
But
newer. I meant it was the newer one because I have that
yeah,
on a photo gallery too. Okay.
but the Matrix is my favorite movie, and we explore the hero's journey. I use this in my work, Hero with a Thousand
Oh God, one
Faces.
of the best nonfiction book I've ever read.
It's
My
incredible, isn't
favorite
it?
nonfiction book. Yeah. Yeah. Hero
Um,
with a Thousand Faces is, yeah, I think it's the best nonfiction book I've ever read.
and what I love about the Matrix are the spiritual elements, stepping into the unknown, the trials, the transformation, and then the return to share what we've learned with the world. What about these stories inspires you at a spiritual level?
It's a great question. And I'm not sure that's where I come from. Right.
Aha.
I think it did.
Mm.
If you look at Indiana Jones or Star Wars, Lucas, Spielberg, like those are, I mean, he worked with Campbell and Moyers, right, to plan Star Wars to a degree. I don't know how much he did, because I don't know how that factors into the trilogy and the editing he did with Star Wars that changed a lot of the story. But I'm really into stories with a lot more moral complexity, right? And I think the
Yes.
part of Dungeons and Dragons, I'm curious about how do you like alignment?
Oh, wow. Good question. So for those of
And we should
people who,
explain, yeah,
yeah, for those who
this is a
don't
nerd
know,
deep cut. Yeah.
in D&D, you sort of choose your character's moral alignment, and there's the law chaotic axis, and there's the good evil axis. Lawful good is your heroic, righteous, typically paladin characters who are honest, trustworthy, selfless, all those things.
But
The
also
opposite of that,
crusaders.
also
They're also
crusaders.
crusaders,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
you
Like
get
it's
that
it's
as
a
well.
very dangerous kind of lawful good. Yeah. Yeah.
And then the opposite of that would be chaotic evil, and that's your bloodthirsty pirates, people who have no regard for anyone else, and they're generally antagonists to be defeated. Um, so you talked about creating yourself as a D&D character and your career. I've done that a little bit with myself too. I started off very much as a nerd, an academic. I liked the intellectual classes, but I also had some fantasies about being a big, strong warrior as well. So um, going back to D&D for a moment, these ones here, this is I believe the third edition plus Forgotten Realms, which is a setting to have adventures in. Um, and what I loved about those books are the illustrations. I'd have to show you one, but um, see if I can find an example. But these books have some just absolutely beautiful pencil illustrations that just sort of set the imagination on fire. Um,
Yeah.
so, for example, something like that, I love
Oh
these
yeah, I
pencil
loved stuff
illustrations.
like that. Yeah,
Yeah,
I loved the illustrations, and the old illustrators were a lot more crude, but also inspiring. And there's one guy, Errol Otis, that I still love. His kind of phantasmagoric artistry.
yeah,
But I think so. My struggle with alignment, and I think,
mm,
and the hero's journey is where we got started. Is this idea that it's also simple,
mm,
right? I think Campbell. It's been 20 years since I read the book, but first of all, large parts of the Hebrew Bible don't follow the hero cycle at all.
mm-hmm,
It's
mm-hmm.
very hard to find the hero's journey in Jacob, Abraham, or Moses exactly.
Yes,
Um, David, maybe. Jesus, maybe. It's also not, the dumbest way to phrase this is a line in The Sopranos where one character is writing a screenplay and he says, I can't figure out what's my arc. And the other character says, I was born, I'm going to die, I don't have an arc. But like human beings, it would be nice if we had an arc, but it's not
mm,
always the case.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
the idea of alignment is that it's very prescriptive about the ways in which we behave relative to order or chaos,
mm-hmm,
anarchy and tyranny, altruism and selfishness.
yeah,
I don't know. I think people are so subtle and complex.
yes,
That's always frustrated me. So to invite my players into stories of moral ambiguity is fun and scary to them. And my wife always overhears things I'm talking about, and she says, if they studied their Bible, they'd know exactly who the villain is, right? Like I give them. There's a lot of less than subtle things. I couldn't have you in my game because you'd pick up on all the, like Amalek. This guy's awful. He's the worst.
yeah. But I like the complexity of those characters. In writing, a good villain has a motivation that we can understand. We don't
Right.
have to agree with it, but we understand what's driving this character.
Do you know that? I don't know if you're into comic books as well, but Magneto.
Yes, I'm
They
familiar with
so in the
Magneto.
early era of comic books, they wouldn't allow the villain to be sympathetic. So it's significantly later that they introduce his backstory as a Holocaust survivor.
Hmm. Hmm.
Right? They didn't want villain in the 50s and 60s for whatever legal or editorial reasons. The villains had to be somewhat banal evil. Right?
Yeah.
That they couldn't be complex. Um, I think life, I think there is real evil in the world. I think it is rare. I have encountered sociopathy. I've
Mm.
encountered pathologies. I've encountered tyranny and corruption. Systems of tyranny and corruption are unfortunately not rare, but
Hmm.
individuals who are lack of soul, tarnished in a certain way,
Yeah.
are extremely rare. Thank God.
Hmm.
I think to the point where it makes it hard to see them because we expect people to be genuine, true, and kind, as 98% of people are. And then you have these sociopath, narcissist, personality disorder, other unnameable or uncategorizable kind of problems. Um, yeah, I think it's much more of a bell curve or a spectrum of qualities in people, and I think what faith systems do, I can only say this for my own faith system, is create
Hmm.
frameworks for our better behaviors to come forward.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean they always do, as we know from the misdeeds of every faith system everywhere and
Yeah,
at any
absolutely.
time. But I think the goal is to create frameworks so that the best of a person can come forward.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating idea that, I know from psychology, many of us have a shadow self. This is a version of ourselves, um, and I struggled with this when I was younger. My first job in Sydney, it's like any big city. I got this position. It was basically like getting a job on Wall Street, really. So I moved away to the big city. I had lots of options, but that gave me a bit of a superiority complex, and I started getting involved with drug gangs, and I started drifting more and more towards the shadow self. And I didn't see myself as a bad person, um, but the temptations were there, and I let myself go down that path. So what I think you're saying is really, really insightful because, you know, we can't put people just into those 9 alignment boxes, can we? They're much more nuanced and much more complex.
I mean, I definitely have lawful neutral days, but
Yeah.
I don't know that or chaotic days, but I don't know
Yeah.
that I have lifetimes of those experiences. You know, it's I mean, I think, like a Myers-Briggs category, like
Yeah. Yeah.
spectra are interesting to sort of as one way of understanding oneself, as long as you don't invest in it as being fixed or actually
Mm.
scientific,
Yeah.
right? They're just interesting sort of polls for
Yeah.
adjectives and descriptors, but they don't prescribe us. And I think that's the danger of astrology.
Yeah.
Like you'll see yourself prescribed as a Sagittarius and then
Yeah.
limited or entitled to certain behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think, that sort of mindset, this is how I am and I accept it, therefore that's okay. Um, if we apply that to negative behavior patterns that we really should
Yeah,
be working on.
yeah, yeah.
So let me ask you, how did your spiritual journey begin and did you experience a calling at any point?
That's such a strange question for a Jew to think about because we don't use the word calling, but I've lived for so
Ah,
long now among people who use the word calling
hmm,
that although there's not an obvious Hebrew or Jewish story equivalent, I absolutely understand myself to have a calling.
yes.
We just don't have a narrative or linguistic way to talk about that. I mean, I guess, Genesis 12 of Abraham being called forth is a calling, or Moses being spoken to at the burning bush. We would call that experience. But rabbis rarely will discuss themselves or describe themselves as having calling, but I absolutely have felt that way for a long time.
Hmm.
Um, I think the first memories I have of career and sort of orientation were in an arboretum in Boston with my grandfather, blessed memory, who was one of the most significant people in my life in terms of support, and caring, and enthusiasm and gift. And I think he asked me, what I imagined. And to a Jewish family, you always want to have like a really illustrious career, attorney, engineer, doctor. It's a story of immigrant families largely. So I said, I want to be an engineer, a sound engineer, which I thought meant I would go to like a technical school like Massachusetts Institute of Technology and be very impressed with me. But I think what I meant was I want to be in a recording studio, right? And be around musicians. I just didn't know how to explain that. But even then, and this is maybe I'm 10 or 12 or 14, certainly before I was conscious of it, anytime I saw a rabbi, I said, that's where I probably want to end up.
Hmm.
Right. Jewish professionals were the ones who kept me alive during the hard times for the most part.
Hmm.
And I knew I wanted to give that back, but I also knew I wanted to have what they had, which was a certain tranquility, wisdom, tenderness, gentleness, openness, was, textual knowledge. I wanted what they had, and I wanted to give what they had away in the next generation.
Hmm.
Whether I succeed at it or not, only the next generation can judge me that way. But and that was the calling, sort of watching the people who I wanted to become. In the same way that I imagine someone goes to a physician when they're 6 and thinks, I'd like to be a doctor one day, or, has someone doing work on their house and thinks, I'd like to be a mason one day. And like you see it and you're inspired by something about that person's character or experience or drive that
Hmm.
ignites a passion in you. A good art teacher will do that for the students. So it was there. It was there before I was conscious of it in a certain way. And then I think, like many people I've talked to, I did a lot of running away from it. Like Jonah does. Like I know there's a place I'd rather be a sailor. Is the way I
Yeah.
always read Jonah. I'd rather be a sailor.
I'd rather be a sailor.
You're a terrible sailor, Jonah.
Yeah, come on.
So I think I had my moments of trying to be a sailor, which is mostly when I went in the Peace Corps and I went to work in Africa. And then I went to Los Angeles to work in the music business. Things I loved, but that made sense much more in part of a constellation of experiences around the spiritual drive, right? The connection to the developing world, and poverty, alleviation of health issues, enhancement of arts as a place of connection and healing, the power of arts making and arts receptivity to transform lives, to be divine, to be epiphany and revelation. I think those all integrate into some sort of mosaic of my career, life, and experience. But it's probably only linear if you look back at it. Right? Like there was no obvious way it was all going to work. But
Yeah.
you take these things in your life that you want to hold on to and you cram them into the life you have. Like I finally started playing drums. I've always wanted to learn how to play drums, and I started
Yeah.
playing 2 months ago, and I love it.
Oh,
So,
brilliant.
and like going back to D&D after years away.
Yeah, yeah. So you had these twin passions. You saw the rabbis and you wanted to experience their spiritual enlightenment, their connection to community, but also the music, the art. Um, how did you eventually combine those two passions?
Well, so this is a theological question that I hope I don't give offense.
No, of
But
course.
to me, Bible and scripture and ritual are arts. And
Mm,
I don't personally understand God to be a perfect being. I don't personally understand scripture to be divine writ or inerrant word. It's possible, as I've said recently, it could be God's voice, but not God's words. And if it is God's words, it's deeply poetic
hmm
and not written. God didn't hand us a history textbook or a science textbook.
mm,
And I think like Shakespeare and like John Coltrane, it's human efforts to understand something much more important than us. And
yes.
this cry out of like desperately wanting to understand why we're here and what is beyond us and what is within us and what's the mystery of it all, and all the questions that no matter how much science we conquer, there's more mystery.
Mm,
Um, what does it mean now in our scientific revolution to be so small and yet so fierce and so loving and so capable of joy and gratitude? um, I love that. And, and I've had a dark night of the soul, and I thought back on Psalm 6 and said, there was this guy, I don't need it to be King David, I don't need it to be God, 2,500, 3,000 years ago, who felt this way. I can do this,
hmm
right? Or the Jonah story where, or the wilderness story where you're like, oh, I'm in wilderness just like they were, or I'm trying to be a sailor just like Jonah did,
Yeah.
right? I think being able to have that connection to deeper stories. One of my oldest friends told me that every time he reads Shakespeare's Othello, he's like, sees it, he thinks maybe this time it'll turn out differently. Which I think is the mark of a great play. Like it's so
Yeah.
inevitable that it's going to be tragic, and then
Yep.
you just hope, you hope.
Maybe Romeo and Juliet will be good this time.
Yeah. I mean, there's all these rabbinic stories about the way Moses dies outside of the land of Israel.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they felt that too. They were like, in his heart, you can tell he didn't want to end there. So they
Yes.
tell all these fan fictions of him, asking God, can I become a bird and travel over the land? Can I become like a breeze and travel over the land? And
Right.
God saying, no, it's your time to die. Like this is as far as you go.
Can we look at that a bit more? Because I think,
Yeah.
you know, Moses' figure, his vocation, his calling was to lead these people to a place. And, I'm coming up at this from a Catholic lens. I've read the Old Testament. And he's worked so hard to get these people here, and then he's just right on the cusp of it, and that's where his journey sort of ends. What sort of Jewish wisdom or insight goes along with that?
I don't know. I mean, I think we were just as frustrated with it
Yeah.
as anyone. I mean, there's a couple of things I could bring up, which is one, um, the joke among rabbis is, it's very hard to be a rabbi to a congregation of Jews. Look, even Moses couldn't do it, right? Because we understand Moses, he said vocation. We understood him to be our first rabbi.
Yes.
Two is that that story is so powerful that the rabbis have pages and pages of fan fiction of
Hmm.
Moses begging and cajoling and tricking God into letting Moses have more
Yeah,
time or more
yeah,
space.
yeah.
They
Just a bit
get
more,
they
please.
get the angst and the nostalgia and the pain of it.
Hmm.
And third and sort of 3.2 or maybe fourth is I think it's one of the greatest endings in all of literature.
Yeah,
I think, to use the common Hollywood parlance, they really stick the landing in the Torah. Like
yeah.
that is a great ending. It's a
Mm.
little like, what, I never put this together until you just said it, but do you know the Tears and Rain speech at the end of Blade Runner?
Yes, I
It's
do.
a little bit like it's the same feeling of like, I've done so much, and yet at the end, I must die anyway, short of my goal. And it
Yes.
will all be dissolved like tears and rain. And I think that whatever that sentiment is called, I think that's why Tears and Rain is such a good scene, because
Yeah.
it's so impossible to figure out what is that nostalgia? Is that grief? What word is that? There's no real word
Mm.
for it, but we all know that feeling.
Yes.
I think that's what Moses feels too. So it's my time to die, and yet, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I think it's the greatest ending. Every year we read through. We have a lectionary too, of a cycle of reading through the Torah, and
Hmm.
every year I think, man, they nailed it.
Yeah.
This is a hard, very painful, and very honest ending.
It is. And oh gosh, that leads me into my next question. Can you think of a time when your faith was seriously challenged by something?
Well, there was last night, and there was 20 years ago. I'll just do both.
Do both.
So I really love what I do, and it seems very clear to me, without sounding vain or arrogant, that this is
Mm.
something I'm built to do, right? To work
Yes.
with artists, this sort of intersection of art and faith and spirituality and creativity. And yet, materially, it's not sustainable yet. As
Hmm.
any new venture,
Yeah.
it's very stressful. And I was very angry. I decided to turn all that into anger and sadness towards God, and sort of, God, if you want me to do this, let's step up your game. Like,
Yeah.
help me figure this out.
Come on. I'm
Yeah,
willing.
I'm willing, right? Like Isaiah, here I am, God. And the other time was after I returned from. I did the Peace Corps. Worked on a presidential campaign. I worked in LA in the music business. Then I came back to live at my parents' house for about 3 months, 2 months before I went to seminary,
Hmm. Hmm.
pre-seminary studies at that point. And yeah, I had a real dark night of the soul. I don't even remember exactly what precipitated the moment. A suicidality was definitely present for the first time in a long
Mm.
time.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I thought about this psalm I had been reading as part of a liturgy, Psalm 6, where the psalmist talks about, every night I soak my bed with tears.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, this dude got it. This happened before, and this will happen again, and I'll be okay. And I got through. And I think about that all the time. I talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
That to me was why I read the Psalms. It's like, oh,
Hmm.
I'm
Hmm.
not alone. This isn't unprecedented. It sucks.
Yeah.
David or whoever wrote these things got it, right? Like, but so did Muddy Waters and the Bluesmen, right? They got that life has a lot of burdens and trials, and they left us this gift to let us. I mean, the art does this too, right? John Coltrane's doing it. Um, Kurosawa's doing it. Cormac McCarthy does it in novels, and Graham Greene. Like, here's the testament. I mean, it's a testament, right? We don't use that word about our scripture, but it is
Yeah.
here's my witnessing, my testament that life was hard,
Yeah.
and with enough effort, I made it a good life,
Hmm. Hmm.
and I made something important out of it.
And I think that's so important to mention, that dark night of the soul. It is a stage of the hero's journey. We have to struggle with our darkest moments, with
Does he use
failure
that
and setback.
phrase?
Yeah, dark night of
Does
the soul.
Campbell talks about the dark night of the soul? It's been a long time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool.
And
He's a
and
good dude. I like the stuff he writes. Is just he was on the point, man.
absolutely. So from those experiences, what was it that brought you back and carried you through from your dark night? How did you transition into a more positive place?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're implying this, but I want to be clear. It wasn't
Sure.
sudden.
Yeah.
It wasn't easy. It wasn't like, oh, that's over.
Mm.
It's, it's the addict's bottom, which isn't always the bottom. Right? Addicts talk about that this idea that there's a bottom and then you just like start climbing. There can be multiple bottoms. There can be no
Yeah.
exact bottom, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That was just a bottom, right? And if you think of, let me make a sidestep to get to a point.
Certainly.
That line, God never gives you more than you can handle, is can't be true, because then
Mm.
there would never be suicide, right?
That's right.
So if you think of suicide, which is really death by mental illness, but let's talk
Yes.
about suicide as the lowest of the low of the human spiritual and emotional experience. Despair,
Despair.
right? Despair is the spiritual part of depression. You It's like incremental. You regain hope and faith and belief, but it's very,
Hmm.
very slow,
Yeah.
and I think probably that, sometime in that summer when I was really at the lowest, I got a girlfriend maybe or something that dragged me
Hmm.
out of my shell a little
Hmm.
and pulled myself out. But I still needed to deal with the fact that I was relying on someone else for my well-being
Yeah. Yeah.
or using relationships compulsively. Now, having this really crying out in the woods yesterday, like, I don't know that nothing new has happened today that's changed anything, but I feel better from crying. Right? I'm
Hmm.
no longer at the bottom. I'm somewhere near the pit,
Yeah.
right? But I'm not like at the mountaintop yet. And I think you do it enough times, you realize like you can live for a long time in the wilderness. Right? There's a lot
Mm.
of wilderness periods. There's a lot of times at sea. And eventually you kind of accommodate yourself to that. A lot of life is in the wandering, I
Yes.
think.
A lot of life is in the one that resonates with me so much. I was speaking earlier when I was living in Sydney, I got mixed up with drugs, and that led to a psychotic breakdown. And I had to leave my job, move back into, well, first I had to go into the psychiatric hospital and then move back into my parents to recover. And it took many years, and to get back to a place where I could work and just do normal day-to-day things. And I call those my wilderness years, really. I was in the wilderness for 16 years, and it was very painful. And I'm, sort of crying out, why won't you heal me? Why won't you deliver me or give me what I want? And I think what I had to learn was patience and
Yeah.
introspection and acceptance, because we don't always get the life that we want or that we ask for or that we think we should have or think we deserve. Um, and I think it was exactly what you said, the hope and the desire for connection and healing that sort of kept me going through those wilderness years.
It's brutal, right?
Yeah,
Like, I mean,
but it is
a lot of
brutal.
the wilderness stories in the Torah are not a lot of happy stories.
Exactly,
And to go
exactly.
back to the point of Moses, like that's it. His life ends in wilderness, right? He probably has a little bit of
Yeah,
time in Egypt and a little bit of time in Midian where he can relax, and the rest of the time he's on the go
yeah.
from with no fixed home.
Mm,
And I think those are probably about the right ratios. Right?
yep.
The majority of our lives are really in a wilderness, and the destinations are maybe they're just oases between voyages.
Hmm. Hmm. Rabbi, is there a person or people who guided you on your spiritual journey?
Yeah, for sure. Probably too many to name, but my mom and dad probably at the
Yeah.
very beginning, right? My grandfather, who was my mother's father, they were all committed to Jewish communities. The early rabbis that I saw and Jewish educators, Yeah. People have asked good questions. I think about when I was in the Peace Corps and people asking me about my faith,
Hmm.
even here in a Southern Christian area. Um, I always think about my landlord. I had a landlord who was very supportive even when I was struggling.
Yep.
My wife, my kids. Kids teach you a lot about theology because you can't just use big words to avoid the problem.
Yep.
Right? Like they ask you very direct questions and you have to be able to explain it in a simple sentence or two. Um, Friends, people like you who want to talk about theology, which isn't
Mm.
everyone. My students, my clients, my congregants who, I had an editor for some of the things I've written, and he said that a synagogue is a laboratory for theology. And I,
Wow.
I love that. So get
I love
yourself a
that too.
laboratory. I guess this is
Yes.
your laboratory.
Hmm.
Yeah. I loved that. I loved, and now I'm on a new journey and it's teaching me new things about God and new things about my own spirituality and what I need and who I am and what God is willing me to do and how hard it is.
Yeah.
You know? But it's also, I mean, I think one of the things I am quote unquote preaching with artists is like, if you're doing the thing you love, it fills you up. Right?
Hmm.
There's one of my favorite stand-up comics, Gary Gulman, says that he thought he would get out of his depression by being really good at basketball, but it doesn't work that way.
No.
But it does sort of work that if you're filled up with passion, it does overwhelm some of the negativity. Right. So if you find the thing you love and you drive towards it and you seek that blessing again and again and again, and you take enough Prozac or whatever medicine you need. I'm a big believer in talk therapies and Prozac
Yes.
and medicines and caring for self, appropriate hygiene. But
Mm.
beyond that, once you create space for yourself to be sane, you do have to go towards the things that fill you with light and passion and warmth and excitement, partly because life is short. And partly because if you don't go towards things that fill you with love and joy, other things will fill you up.
Yes.
Like work and mundane tasks.
So
Um,
let's talk a little bit more about the things you love. You said
okay,
science
yeah,
fiction. I love The
science fiction.
Martian. That was a fantastic
Was it a good? Is
book.
it a good book? Okay, okay,
The movie with Matt Damon is
yeah.
pretty
I
good
heard the
too,
book's
but
very good. Yeah.
it's the movie's quite condensed.
Okay.
What's your favorite science fiction story? Mine's The Matrix.
Oh God. I mean, I enjoy William Gibson's writing just because
Hmm.
it's really
Neuromancer.
tight. Yeah, all of it's just really tight and fun. Um, Jeff Vandermeer's writing is beautiful, but I had an encounter with him online that was very unpleasant.
Oh no.
Um, eh. Book of the New Sun is beautiful, but very sexist.
Hmm.
The piece of science fiction that I think is the most spiritually meaningful to me is the movie Sunshine, the Danny Boyle movie with Cillian Murphy and a great cast of astronauts trying to reignite the dying sun, because I think
Yes, I think I've seen the movie.
it's beautiful.
Hmm.
It's well directed and acted. And the ending is, to me, when people ask me what I think happens after we die, I think about the scene at the end of Sunshine. I think that's how we die. I don't want to spoil it, but if you watch the movie, you'll see like, oh, they become infatuated with the sun, which I think is symbolic of God and sort of ultimate power. And they attracted towards dissolving into ultimate power. And I think
Yeah.
that's what happens when we die. We dissolve back into the Godhead, the
Hmm.
universe, the undifferentiated. What other great stories? What am I into right now? I'm reading a lot of James Baldwin, who, I don't know where Australia is, but we're in another multiracial reckoning. We are in another period of social turmoil. And
Hmm.
as the psalmist comforted me to know that James Baldwin struggled with all these issues of compassion and humanity and wisdom in the 50s, which
Yeah.
is, what is that, 70 years ago now? Like, oh, I'm okay. He knew this pain. He knew this struggle. Like, I can get through it too.
Yeah.
Um, what else have I loved recently? I'm reading T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, which are beautiful, but I don't. Seneca,
Oh
Seneca's
wow.
Letters to a Stoic. Those are great. I read the Psalms every morning.
Yep.
Uh, I watched the third season of The Bear, which wasn't very good. I really am into currently these YouTube shorts by a guy named Rudy Ayub, which is about it's scenes of him and he plays all the roles, but it's him and his Arab father, his Lebanese father, making fun
Yeah.
of him. They're pretty good. They're good YouTube shorts, you know.
And I think for me, I've growing up as a
Stand-up
kid,
comedy, always stand-up comedy.
stand up
I
is
would
great.
always go back to
Yeah,
stand-up comedy too.
I love stand up. But for me as a child growing up, I loved to read fiction. And now as an adult, what I love is finding the truth in fiction, in these stories that we explore and what they tell us about humanity
Yeah.
as a race, the individual spirit, and all these things. I think there's a lot of truth in fiction, and I think unfortunately this is something I wanted to talk about. Back in the 80s when D&D first came out, there was a whole faction saying this game is a cult, this game is satanic.
I wish.
But
It's
you
not
know
it was not that exciting.
it's not that exciting. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned Critical Role. People are playing this game in mass now. You can watch it
Yeah, yeah.
streamed, and while there certainly are monsters and demons in the game, they technically serve as antagonists for the heroes to defeat, or perhaps challenge in some other way. I'll give you something powerful, and all it costs is your soul. And you say, no, I will defeat you, evil monster. I will not take this. Um, so I think what truths or memorable lessons have you learned by exploring fiction or Dungeons and
Oh,
Dragons?
all of them.
All of them.
All of them. I mean, I love Joseph Campbell and he's
Yeah.
right.
Hmm.
And I love science and it's true.
Yeah.
It's factual. I should be
Yeah.
really careful in my words. It is
Yes.
factual and there are truths to it. But I would say whenever I taught, like I get called in to do a guest talk at a high school or junior high school class about religion.
Hmm.
And I would say, like for one thing, even if the Bible were written by God word for word, why do we assume that it's a history book or a science book? Those aren't spiritually meaningful books, right? Like I've never been inspired by a history book in the same way that I'm inspired by poetry. And then the example I would give is, you could watch a documentary about World War II, or you could watch Casablanca. And
Yeah.
nothing in Casablanca is factual or historical
Yeah.
exactly, but everything is true,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
That we sacrifice for love, that we become better people as with trial, that we can be cold to each other, that we can be loving and supportive to each other, that people have multiple sides, that evil is real, but good is difficult. Yeah. I mean, I don't, and here's the thing one I've been thinking about a lot recently. I don't think people like Jacob in Torah were physical people.
Hmm.
And I do believe I will meet him in heaven.
Hmm.
I don't know what that means, but I
Yeah.
am confident that I will get to hang out with Jacob and Moses and Jimi Hendrix in heaven and my
Yeah.
grandfather. And I don't know what that'll be like,
Yeah.
but they weren't. I don't know. I mean, historicity isn't that interesting to me. I don't know what your languages are, but in French, the word for story and history are the same word.
Je
And
parle un peu
and
de
and
français.
yeah, histoire is like they didn't
Histoire.
care, right? Like a story and a history used to. Herodotus and Josephus, when they wrote the histories, as I was told, I haven't studied it enough to have my own opinion, but I was told they were interested in what made the best story, not what was the most granular accuracy,
Yeah.
right? And yes, and I think that Sunshine, and I'm going to be sure that my players are not tuned into this because I'm going to tell you something about the campaign they're running,
Okay.
where they're confronting this AI.
Yep.
And the theme of the AI is, can God remain neutral? Because the AI is nominally just the information exchange for the galaxy, but
Yes.
there is this temptation to interfere, right? So
Yeah.
can something with ultimate power remain neutral? That's sort of the theological question under the whole play.
Right. Okay.
And so all of it, I just think, yeah, I think truth is much more interesting to me than fact. I don't want there's
Truth is more interesting
falsehood,
than fact.
right? But there's also falsehood, right? Like I
Hmm.
think climate
Hmm.
change is absolutely real, and a scientific consensus that, the
Mm.
scientific consensus around climate change is undeniable.
Yeah.
Um, but so I don't think, I think there's a lot of truths, but that doesn't mean there aren't falsehoods.
Yes.
And I think we can learn just as much from Jonah as we can from a history of that era. Right. I
Yeah.
think Jonah has, to me, I keep returning to Jonah and Esther. I mean, Esther is
Mm.
clearly not a real thing. Right. And the
Yeah.
sages, even the rabbis, debated about Job. Like, the consensus about Job by the rabbis was he's not a person. He's a hyperbole or an
Yeah.
experience, right?
Yeah.
So I don't need those things to be flesh and blood embodied at any period.
Mm. Mm.
In fact, it's more complicated for me. I think one of the things that has kept me away from Christianity is, like, I don't see how you can, because Jesus is indisputably an historical figure. So you're stuck
Mm.
with, like, oh, I'd rather it all be a metaphor.
Yeah.
It would be
Well,
so much easier if it were just a metaphor.
exactly. And I think, for me, scripture is about theological truth rather than literal
Yeah.
truth, and trying to situate these events at a particular point in history, at a particular location. If we tried really hard, maybe we could do it, but the point is the lesson we're trying to teach. And I think,
Yeah.
like, for example, I think for me, Saving Private Ryan is an absolutely brilliant movie that illuminates so much of the human condition, the
Yeah. It does
nature
actually. Yeah.
of conflict, and what it means to serve a higher purpose. Now, the characters in this movie weren't characters, so it's not factual, but it is absolutely true. And that concept very much resonates with me, that we can tell a story, a fictitious story that's nevertheless grounded in historical events, that shows us some meaningful truth that it's important for us to grasp.
I mean, I would say I'm practicing my heresy,
Hmm.
which is that I find truth. I remember this in a rabbinical school interview. Do you think the Bible is a book or the book?
Yeah,
I don't remember what I said, but I know he wanted me to say the book.
the
And I
book.
don't. I think Shakespeare also has truth,
Yes.
right? And I think I said Coltrane, James Brown, like they had truths. They also had mistakes and falsehoods, just like Leviticus did.
Mm.
But I don't know. I feel like that's what really matters, is this sense of, like, the reverberation through time of other people's experiences and other people's
Mm.
generosity, and being so candid with us as artists,
Hmm. Hmm.
and digging so deep to show us what their pains and joys were, and
Yeah.
committing that to tape or a scroll.
Yeah.
Wow. And then,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, I think there's more truth in art than almost anything else. And by art, I would include large stretches of the Bible, which are, Psalms is all art. Parts of, I think, Deuteronomy is quite beautiful. Deuteronomy is a strangely beautiful book in that it's a
Yeah.
poem that it's law set to poetry, which is like an incredibly weird genre. Um,
Law
you know,
censored poetry. Yeah.
I don't know. I think there's some, a friend of mine is teaching the book of Judges,
Mm.
and he picked up on one thing that I've always thought, and one thing that I had never thought about, which is the thing I've always thought about is that the Bible's idea of morality in the early Hebrew Bible is the worst kind of morality is, the quote is, every person doing what is in his heart, right? Every person doing what he feels right.
Hmm.
That's the worst kind of morality.
Hmm.
And that's one of the morals of the book of Judges. Like, look what happens when
Yeah.
everybody does their own thing.
Yeah.
And the other thing he said about Judges, and I think this is true through Samuel and probably Kings, is like, are we supposed to be revolted by the violence or enamored of the violence?
Yes.
Are we
Yes.
supposed to approve or be scared, or a little of both, probably?
Yeah. Yeah.
I thought that was a very interesting lens. Like,
Absolutely. And I found that when reading the book of Joshua,
Yeah,
the,
Joshua too.
the Exodus is completed. We've come to the Holy Land, and we're now taking possession of it.
Let's
And
murder some people.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Show no mercy. Um,
Yeah.
and it's highly challenging, and I'm trying to say, okay, what's the theological truth here? You know, and I can see, yes, God is fulfilling a promise, um, but these poor people, all they've done is live in the wrong place, and now we have to remove them. I find that
I,
extremely challenging.
I don't know if I would call it a theological truth, but I think the
Mm.
truth of those experiences that humans can be unbearably cruel.
Yes. Yep.
Like that murder and genocide and intergroup violence is not new
Hmm.
and is an inherent part of our makeup and soul.
Yep.
And that every other thing we do as a society has to be to tamp that down,
Yep.
whether it's religion or the state.
Yes.
That we it points out like people are horrible if you let them be horrible.
And so, do you think there is some value in a system, whether it's a religious system or a political system, that helps people live together in community? Um, you know, for example, the Ten Commandments, or some of the laws in Leviticus. Do you think there's value in just having? I'm studying theological ethics at the moment, and just having a rule set that people follow, even if it's not entirely clear where it comes from, it does restrain some of those really base aspects of the human condition.
Well, okay, so let's as we head towards wrapping up, I'm going to go with my
Sure.
a bombshell of what if God were just the dungeon master, the game master,
Okay. Yeah, I'm
right?
on board with this.
Like, and the game has rules. They're not they're not exactly arbitrary because good rules create certain experiences. Like some games are more fun to play than others because the rules are set such that to maximize enjoyment and to maximize success and challenge. God, as for those of us who play role playing games, the game master plans this beautiful world and all these exciting
Mm,
rules and gives people their statistics, their capacities, and then they run havoc. They wreak
yes.
havoc with the world. The worst thing that can happen to a town is that the players come through. Like
Yeah.
that's a good way for towns to get decimated as party of adventurers comes through and just decides to burn the whole town down, which is the book. So the book Blood Meridian by the local author Cormac McCarthy is I'm reading it and I realized it's basically murder hobos. They're murder
Yeah.
hobos.
Yeah.
So look it
And
up
that's a
if you're
terrible
listening to the
use.
podcast.
Yeah.
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 And I think, and then there's this scene in the Talmud, and I think it's in the Torah too, of, God looks at our actions and is amused by our capacity for not so much for violence, but to, to disrupt God's plan. Right.
Yes.
I know as a dungeon master, there are dungeon masters who insist that the players play the way she or he had in mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I am never more delighted than when my players ruin all my plans. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
scared because I don't know what I'm going to do next. But I think, man, that is a genius solution that I would never have thought of. And now I have to start. Like, I'm just going to throw out
Yeah.
all my plans and all the maps I drew because you
Yeah.
just inundated it with water, and now you don't even need to deal with it.
Yeah.
And it's cool, right?
It is.
Or when people behave according to not just their trope, but I loved the show Cheers growing up, and one of the things I loved about it was that it was almost predictable. Like the
Mhm.
characters were so strong, you knew the joke they were going to make. And you get that when people have been playing, and you mentioned you had a game that lasted a decade, and I've had games that last a year or two. You start to know the characters and the rhythms, and you can anticipate
Yeah.
the way people will behave. And then the times that they surprise you, or the times that they succeed when you thought they'd fail, or against all odds, or just, and you're cheering each other on. And I think
Yeah.
that's how I experience God. I think
Hmm.
God doesn't have the power to stop us from, rolling the dice,
Yeah.
getting into trouble, and saving the world. And good. it's really sweet that God created such a wonderful realm for us to play in.
And I absolutely love that idea. God is the dungeon master. I've created this wonderful world for you. I've given you character sheets,
Oh, you ruined it
but
again.
you've gone and done something completely unexpected, and now we just have to roll with it.
Yeah. You ruined it again. Oh
You
man,
ruined it again. Come on.
give me a second. I got to plan. I got to think what happens next. I had no plan for this.
Yep.
Oh,
Come up with something on
yeah,
the fly.
yeah.
So
Oh,
finally, Rabbi, just to finish, what spiritual insights have you gained from your journey?
wow. I mean, I think the more recent one is just that being an artist is hard. Society should cherish them in a way that it doesn't seem to understand, and that art is fundamentally a proof of, and art is about God. I still think courage is one of the most important values a human being can have. And somewhere, if it's a close second or tied, is creativity. Those are the two things I think everyone should live with: is courage and creativity, and the courage to be creative. Um, Gratitude and pride are really important. I know pride for the work we do, and gratitude for things that come our way. Not pride like arrogance, but I really worked hard to be a better musician, and I'm proud even if I don't get first chair.
Yeah.
Small things matter. The things we overlook, like family and home, are really important. Everyone should go walking. Everyone should walk the land. Everyone should walk. One of Judaism's lessons is that not doing things is also fun. Refraining from things can be really spiritually fun. Whether for Jews, not eating certain things or not working on certain days is very fun. Play, never stop playing, and never stop learning, and never stop growing. I've seen people who have made those mistakes. Life is too short and too much of a gift to slow down. Not to slow down, but I think Goethe said, "Do not hurry, do not rest." Just use this life, use it all up. So, yeah, it's a good question. I should make a list, because there's probably things I forgot. But yeah, I'm glad I can answer that question. Like that to me says I've lived my life decently enough, that I have spiritual lessons I've learned.
Rabbi Alon Ferency, thank you so much for
Thank you so
speaking
much,
with me
John.
today.
This is a delight. I wish you
Absolutely.
all the best success.
You
Take
too,
care of
mate.
yourself.